Somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 years ago, something crossed the Red Sea. Not an army, not a single dramatic invasion, something slower and stranger, an alphabet, a set of gods, a style of temple architecture, and, it now seems, a measurable trickle of human DNA moving from the south tip of Arabia into the highlands of Ethiopia. For over a century, historians argued about how much of ancient Ethiopian civilization actually came from Arabia versus how much grew up entirely on its own African soil. Old-school scholars once claimed the answer was almost everything, that Arabian settlers arrived and basically founded Ethiopian civilization from scratch. Modern genetics has now had its say, and the real story turns out to be far more interesting than either the old colonial theory or the flat denial that replaced it. It's a story about writing systems that traveled without armies, ancient stone temples with unmistakable Arabian fingerprints, and a genetic signal so subtle it took a molecular clock to even detect it. Let's get into what actually crossed that sea and what stayed behind. Long before anyone had sequenced a single strand of DNA, travelers and scholars stood in front of certain Ethiopian ruins and asked an obvious question: how did this get here? In the northern highlands, near the modern town of Yeha, stands a temple made of massive, precisely cut limestone blocks fitted together without mortar, rising in a style that has almost nothing in common with anything else built in the region at the time. Its layout, its moon god iconography, and its inscriptions bear an unmistakable resemblance to religious architecture found across the Red Sea, in what's now Yemen. The inscriptions themselves are written in a script and language closely related to Sabaean, the language of the ancient South Arabian kingdom of Saba, famous in later legend as the homeland of the Queen of Sheba. For a long time, this was treated as close to a smoking gun. If the temple looks Sabaean, the script is Sabaean, and the god being worshipped is a South Arabian deity, then the obvious conclusion seemed to be that South Arabians had simply crossed the sea, arrived in force, and built the earliest Ethiopian kingdoms as a kind of colonial outpost of Arabia. That theory had a name. The kingdom associated with these sites became known as Dumped, and for decades, textbooks described it in language that made ancient Ethiopia sound less like an independent civilization and more like an overseas territory of Arabia. It's a tidy story. It also turns out to be substantially wrong, or at least wildly oversimplified. And figuring out exactly how wrong required moving past architecture and inscriptions and into the genome itself. Here's the problem with judging an entire population's ancestry by its temples and its writing systems. Cultures borrow. They borrow constantly, and they borrow far more easily than people migrate. A shared script doesn't require a shared bloodline, any more than the spread of the Latin alphabet across the modern world means half the planet is genetically Roman. Trade networks connecting the Arabian coast to the African coast across the narrow mouth of the Red Sea had existed for a very long time before the Dumped period. Merchants moving incense, ivory, gold, and obsidian back and forth, along with the ideas and religious practices that travel naturally alongside merchants. A ruling elite adopting a prestigious foreign script and a foreign deity to legitimize its authority is one of the most common patterns in ancient history worldwide, and it requires nothing more than a handful of scribes, priests, or traders settling in and being absorbed into an existing society, not a demographic replacement of the population underneath them. So by the time modern researchers turned to this question, there were really two entirely separate things being asked at once, and earlier generations of scholars had mostly collapsed them into one. The first question is cultural. Did religious ideas, writing, and architectural style move from South Arabia into the Ethiopian highlands? The archaeological answer to that one has never really been in doubt. Yes, clearly something moved. The second question is biological. Did a substantial number of actual South Arabian people move there too, in numbers large enough to leave a lasting genetic signature in the population that exists today? That second question could only be answered by looking directly at DNA, and it took decades of technological progress before anyone could actually do that with any precision. To answer the biological question properly, geneticists rely on the same three broad categories of evidence used in nearly every ancient ancestry study. Y-chromosome DNA, passed almost unchanged from father to son, traces a strict paternal line back through the generations. Mitochondrial DNA, passed from mother to child, traces an equally strict maternal line. And autosomal DNA, the much larger, shuffled portion of the genome inherited from both parents, provides a broad statistical snapshot of overall ancestry, admixture, and the approximate timing of major population contacts. Each of these lines of evidence answers a slightly different version of the same underlying question, and each carries its own specific, testable prediction for what a genuine large-scale Arabian migration into Ethiopia should look like. If a real wave of Sabaean settlers had arrived in the first millennium BCE and mixed substantially into the highland population, you would expect a chunky, statistically obvious block of Arabian ancestry sitting on top of the existing African genetic base, concentrated specifically in populations living closest to the old dumped heartland and dating cleanly to that same narrow historical window. That is a very specific signature, and it's the kind of signature that either shows up clearly in the data or doesn't.
Before turning to the DNA itself, there's a linguistic wrinkle that quietly undermined the simple one-way migration story for a long time, and it deserves its own moment. Ethiopian Semitic languages, Amharic, Tigrinya, Ge'ez, and their relatives, belong to the same broad Semitic language family as Arabic and Hebrew, which is exactly what you'd expect if the story were simply Arabians arriving and imposing their language on Africa. But linguists studying the deep structure of these languages kept running into a puzzle. Ethiopian Semitic languages preserve certain grammatical features that are actually more archaic, more conservative than what survives in modern South Arabian languages themselves, features that look like they split off from the common ancestor of the whole Semitic family at a very early stage, rather than arriving as a late import from a fully formed Sabaean kingdom. Some linguists began arguing for something almost the reverse of the old assumption that Semitic languages may have first crossed from the Horn of Africa into Arabia, not the other way around, with the later South Arabian influence on Ethiopia representing a secondary wave layered on top of a much older, existing linguistic connection between the two shores. That's not a settled debate even today, but it planted an important seed. It suggested the relationship between Ethiopia and Arabia was never a simple one-directional story of settlers arriving on empty ground. It was always a back-and-forth conversation across a genuinely narrow stretch of water, running in both directions over a very long span of time, which is almost exactly what the genetic data would go on to confirm. When researchers examined Y-chromosome data from populations in the northern Ethiopian and Eritrean highlands, the descendants of the region once associated with DMT and the later Aksumite kingdom, they were looking for the same kind of signal that would indicate a genuine founding population of Arabian men. And they found something, but not nearly enough of it to support the old colonization narrative. Certain Y-chromosome haplogroups associated with the Near East and Arabian Peninsula, including variants within haplogroup J, do appear in the Ethiopian highlands at frequencies meaningfully higher than in populations further south and west, in Ethiopia and East Africa more broadly. That's a real detectable signal, and it's concentrated in roughly the right geography. But the dominant paternal lineages across the highland population remain African in origin. the same broad East African haplogroups found throughout the region, regardless of any Arabian contact at all. In other words, there was contact, and it left a real trace, but nothing close to the wholesale genetic replacement that a large founding colony of Arabian men would have produced. The fathers, broadly speaking, were mostly already there. The maternal, mitochondrial evidence makes the picture even sharper, and it cuts hard against the old top-down colonization theory in a specific way. If the story really were foreign men arriving and establishing a ruling elite, a pattern seen in plenty of other historical colonization events, where incoming men take local wives and the maternal lineages of the resulting population stay overwhelmingly indigenous while the paternal lineages shift dramatically, you'd expect Ethiopian highland mitochondrial DNA to look almost entirely African, with the Arabian signal concentrated almost exclusively on the paternal side. And to a significant degree, that pattern does hold. Ethiopian highland maternal lineages remain dominated by African haplogroups, particularly variants within the L branches that are common and ancient across the continent. But there's also a small, genuinely non-random presence of haplogroups more typically associated with Arabia and the wider Near East, including certain M and N branch lineages that show up at low but real frequencies, specifically in northern Ethiopian populations. That detail matters because it means the exchange wasn't purely a one-way flow of men marrying into a settled African population. Some women moved too, in both directions, which points less towards a single conquering colony and more towards sustained trade contact, intermarriage, and cultural exchange, running back and forth across the Red Sea for a long stretch of time, not a one-time founding event. The most useful tool in this entire investigation is the ability to actually date these ancient genetic contributions, using the same recombination-based methods that function like a molecular clock, measuring how genetic segments break down and reshuffle generation after generation to estimate roughly when an outside population first mixed into a local one. When researchers ran this analysis on the Arabian-associated genetic signal found in northern Ethiopian and Eritrean populations, the results consistently pointed to a window stretching very roughly from around 3,000 years ago, give or take several centuries, which lines up strikingly well with the archaeological dating of the DMT period and the early spread of Sabaean-influenced culture into the highlands. That's a genuinely satisfying convergence. Two completely independent lines of evidence, one carved in stone inscriptions and temple foundations, the other buried in the statistical structure of modern DNA, landing on roughly the same historical era without either one being designed with the other in mind. But the size of that genetic contribution, even at its likely origin point, was never large. It looks like the trace of a real but limited movement of people, traders, religious specialists, small groups of settlers integrating into existing highland communities, absorbing elements of their culture and, to a real but limited degree, their bloodlines, and turning all of it into something new. DMT wasn't Arabia's outpost in Africa.
It was an African kingdom that had a real, substantial, and lasting relationship with Arabia, which is a very different thing and arguably a far more interesting one. It's worth pausing on why the simpler, more dramatic colonization theory held on in serious scholarship for as long as it did, because the answer says something important about how history gets written in the first place. For a large chunk of the 20th century, the people writing about ancient African civilizations were disproportionately European scholars, operating inside a set of assumptions, often unstated, that sophisticated architecture, writing systems, and organized kingdoms appearing in Africa needed to be explained by outside influence rather than credited to African societies developing them independently. Under that lens, a monumental limestone temple with clear artistic sophistication practically demanded an external origin story, and Arabia, sitting conveniently close across a narrow sea with its own well-documented ancient kingdoms, was the obvious candidate to supply one.
It's a pattern that shows up again and again across the history of archaeology on the African continent, and it took later generations of researchers working with better excavation methods and eventually with genetic tools that simply didn't exist earlier to go back and actually test those old assumptions against real evidence rather than inherited intuition. What they found wasn't that the old theory was completely invented out of nothing. There really was contact, real cultural transmission, and a real measurable genetic signal from across the Red Sea. What they found was that the size and shape of that contact had been dramatically overstated, stretched from a genuine cross-cultural relationship into something closer to a founding myth of foreign superiority. This same underlying pattern, real Arabian contact, wildly overstated Arabian origin, echoes forward into the story of the later and far more famous Aksumite kingdom, which rose in roughly the same highland region centuries after Demont declined, and eventually became one of the great trading powers of the ancient world, minting its own coinage and controlling Red Sea commerce between Rome, Persia, and India. Aksum's own royal inscriptions and later national epic, the Kebra Nagast, lean heavily into legendary Arabian and Solomonic connection, tracing royal legitimacy back through the Queen of Sheba's journey to Jerusalem and her son's return to Ethiopia. It's a powerful founding story, and it isn't pulled from nowhere. It reflects a real, centuries-deep memory of meaningful contact and exchange across the Red Sea, the same contact that genetics independently confirms happened and can even roughly date. But exactly like the Demont period before it, the genetic makeup of the Aksumite population and its modern highland descendants remains overwhelmingly rooted in African ancestry, with the Arabian genetic thread present as a real, old but modest layer rather than a founding population. The legend and the science are once again telling versions of the same underlying story from two completely different directions, one preserved in royal memory and religious narrative, the other reconstructed from the statistical architecture of the genome, and once again they land closer together than either extreme version of the story would predict. Step back from Ethiopia specifically, and this case fits into a much larger pattern that keeps showing up wherever geneticists have gone looking. Ancient cultural transmission and ancient population movement are not the same phenomenon, and confusing the two has misled historians again and again across completely unrelated regions of the world. Writing systems, religious practices, architectural styles, and even entire language families can move across cultural boundaries far more easily, far more quickly, and with far fewer actual people involved than older generations of scholars assumed, riding along trade networks and prestige economies rather than requiring armies or mass settlement. At the same time, genuine measurable population movement absolutely does happen and does leave a permanent, datable trace in the genome of descendant populations centuries or even millennia later, which means the two questions, did ideas move and did people move, have to be investigated separately, using separate kinds of evidence, rather than assumed to rise and fall together. The Ethiopian Arabian case is a particularly clean example of exactly that principle in action, precisely because the cultural evidence looked so overwhelming on its own that it took modern genetic sequencing to reveal how much more modest and how much more mutual the actual biological relationship really was. So what did cross the Red Sea in the end between ancient South Arabia and the Ethiopian highlands? A script, clearly, since Ethiopian writing systems descend in part from South Arabian models. A set of religious ideas and temple-building traditions, visible in stone at Yeha and nowhere else in the region. A real, if modest, contribution to the local gene pool, detectable today and datable to roughly the same era the archaeology points to, running in both directions rather than purely one way. And underneath it all, a population that was already there, already African, already building the foundations of a highland civilization before any of that contact ever began, and that absorbed everything it received from across the water into something distinctly its own, rather than being founded by it.
That's a genuinely more interesting story than the old one about Arabian colonizers arriving to civilize an empty landscape, because it's a story about exchange between two ancient, sophisticated societies sitting on opposite shores of a narrow sea, rather than a story about one civilization simply replacing another. The DNA didn't hand modern researchers a dramatic revelation that nobody expected in the way of ancient conspiracy or lost technology. It did something quieter and in its own way more remarkable. It took a story people had told for a century and gently, precisely corrected it, replacing an old myth of one-directional conquest with a more accurate, more human picture of two ancient peoples who had been talking to each other, trading with each other, and occasionally marrying each other across a narrow strip of water for a very long time.